Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video we'll be going in depth on Protection Paladin in Season 2 of The War Within, including changes the spec is seeing going into the patch, talent build recommendations for both Raid and Mythic Plus, as well as general tips and tricks when it comes to things like your rotation, survivability, useful macros, and more. I also have a written guide that details all this stuff as well, if that's something that works better for you, which you can find over on the Method website, and I'll link that down in the description below as well. If anything major happens to Prot Paladin over the course of this patch, that written guide will be updated. Plus, it does have some useful things that I'm not going to cover in this video just to save time, like my thoughts on all the trinkets available in the new season, recommended enchants, consumables, stuff like that. To start out, I do want to quickly go over the basics of Prot Paladins for anyone who may be entirely new to the spec, so if that's not you, feel free to skip this section using the chapters below. Like many other specs in the game, Prot is a builder-spender spec, though instead of filling up a resource bar like some of the other tanks, you are going to be using Holy Power, which functions similarly to combo points and are generated by many of your short cooldown abilities like Judgment, Hammer of Wrath, and Blessed Hammer, which are going to make up the bulk of your rotation. Holy Power is capped at 5, and you're able to spend it in sets of 3 by using Shield of the Righteous to do some damage and maintain a defensive buff, or instead you can use Word of Glory in order to heal yourself or allies. Outside of that, paladins have a ton of great utility in the form of blessings that they can once again use on themselves or an ally, and in general, this makes them a strong choice in all forms of group content. Prot specifically brings a special blessing in Spell Warding, which is a magic damage immunity, plus the base kit of Prot also allows them to lock down individual spellcasters better than any other spec in the game, giving them some unique value. In terms of hero talent options, you've got Lightsmith, which doubles down on the fantasy of empowering allies, as well as Templar, which instead opts to allow you to rain down hammers on your enemies. Both of these get used in various forms of content, so I'll go over builds for both of them in a future section. Now, before getting too far into this video, I did want to discuss the main changes Prot is getting going into 11.1. The spec was an extremely powerful option in Mythic Plus at the end of Season 1, so going into Season 2, it is no surprise that they are catching quite a few nerfs to bring them more in line with the other tank specs, but there are also a couple buffs in here as well. So let's go through it. So to start, 15% damage increase to Prot Paladin. This is part of a bigger change to all tanks, where they actually flat buff the damage of every single one of them, and this actually turns out to be kind of a relative nerf if you look at all the other numbers, because 15% is one of the lower buffs. I think actually the lowest damage buff to any of the tanks, so this is a relative nerf when you're comparing Prot's damage to everything else. And obviously this is paired now with the talent Refining Fires also getting a 30% damage reduction, and you are still going to spec into it. So overall, Paladin's damage is much more in line with the other tank specs now, when before it had a pretty significant lead. When it comes to survivability, you've got the strength in adversity nerf here. So let's go to the talent page. It's down here. This is very, very common in all Mythic Plus builds. It was giving 5% parry for each target hit with Avenger's Shield, so it would cap out at 25%. This is now going to cap out at 15% parry, so that's a pretty substantial mitigation nerf when you consider, larger pulls in Mythic Plus, where you have a lot of melee swings hitting you. But in a raid environment, this doesn't really impact your survivability at all, because it's not a talent that you were taking often, if ever. They also reduced the CDR of Uther's Council, this talent over here. This was previously 30% cooldown reduction on all of those different spells there in the tooltip. Now it's 15%, so that actually really hurts your uptime on things like Bubble Taunt with a Final Stand here. That really hurts your uptime on Spell Warding, on Blessing of Protection. So again, potentially this hurts Mythic Plus more than Raid, but this can also actually impact Raid as well, depending on boss timings. For Templar, there was a very minor buff here to Undisputed Ruling, where this now also causes Hammer of Light to grant a Shield of the Righteous use, as well as erupt Consecration beneath your target. Now, the theory behind this is very nice, right? It frees up a global from Consecrate when you'd want to be spending things to extend Shake the Heavens. It gives you some more uptime on Shield of the Righteous to make you feel less bad for spending Holy Power on Hammer of Light. However, currently it is a bit bugged, at least as of the recording of this video, where the Shield of the Righteous buff is overriding your current Shield of the Righteous, so it's making it whatever duration it was, only 4.5 seconds, even if it was longer. And the Consecrate drop doesn't count as a defensive Consecrate, so you don't get your Mastery buff for standing in it. So assuming those two bugs get fixed, and those are bugs, of course, assuming they're bugs, then this is very, very nice quality of life change for Templar, but again, currently a little bit bugged. As for Lightsmith, there was a significant nerf here to Tempered in Battle, where the very last sentence of here is that nerf may only occur once per cast. So basically, the health redistribution is only going to happen a single time per Sacred Weapon cast for Tempered in Battle, which is a very, very significant nerf to the durability this provides to you as a Paladin. It can still save you in a pinch in some situations, but it's just going to be significantly less consistent now. Overall, these are obviously some very significant nerfs to Prot Paladin, specifically in Mythic Plus, but it's important to remember that Paladin was by far the best tank in Mythic Plus by the end of Season 1, so it's likely going to remain a strong option in both Raid and Mythic Plus going into Season 2, regardless of these losses, especially since they still bring that very powerful Paladin utility kit. And if you were really enjoying the playstyle of Paladin, don't worry, that is completely unchanged. From there, I want to talk about the tier set. So the new tier set here, item sets, there we go. Oath of the Aureate Sentry. So Blizzard is actually trying something new out this patch, where they're giving all tanks a similar two-piece bonus themed around the Undermine patch, and theirs is called Luck of the Draw. So basically, this has a chance to proc upon taking damage, and it grants you 4 seconds of a major defensive cooldown, which in the case of Prot Paladin is Guardian of the Ancient Kings. And then it also gives you a separate buff that is a 15% damage increase for 10 seconds. So defensively, immediately, this two-piece is extremely lackluster. You're never really a fan of random proc defensives. As a tank, it also only has like 1 ppm, so it's not going to have very, very high uptime, seeing as it's only a 4-second buff. Mythic Plus, you can probably get okay value out of it, as if it procs kind of anywhere in a pull, it's probably fine. But in Raid, it's pretty unlikely, especially because it has that damage taken requirement on it, and there's a lot of situations where you as a tank are really not taking any damage, or just taking very little damage from the the general raid damage going out, which is going to be a little bit problematic in terms of proccing your tier set if you're not going out of your way to take damage. Now the 4-piece for Paladin is actually on the stronger end. It causes that Luck of the Draw proc to also allow your Shield of the Righteous to refund 1 to 3 holy power, and also extend the duration of the damage buff, the 10-second 15% damage buff, by 0.5 seconds per Shield of the Righteous, up to a max of 10 seconds. So this amps up both the offensive and defensive value of this tier set as a whole, allowing you to kind of machine gun Shield of the Righteous cast when you actually proc, especially if you proc during your Avenging Wrath, because you're basically just generating so much holy power. You're able to spend it really, really fast on Shield of the Righteous, just constantly spamming Shield of the Righteous, and that in turn gives you not only more damage, but also much more CDR on all of your defensive abilities through your kit, which we are going to discuss in depth here in just a moment. Overall, while the 2-piece isn't great on its own, when combined with the 4-piece bonus, I'd say that Paladins probably have one of the better tank tier sets this season. Now, let's move on here to talk talents. That's the map. There we go. I'm going to start here talking Lightsmith, and then I'll discuss Templar. And if you're looking for the talent strings here, all of them are going to be linked in the method guide again down in the description. Currently for Lightsmith, it's the main choice in Season 1 and basically all forms of content. Moving into Season 2, it's looking like Lightsmith is kind of going to be a single target specialist build in Raid specifically. And then when it comes to Mythic Plus, it seems to be falling a bit behind Templar in terms of damage output, but it's still going to be relatively stable in terms of, utility and defensiveness. So if you want to play Lightsmith in Mythic Plus after getting your tier bonus, it's still going to be just fine in terms of tankiness. So if you just don't want to play the Templar minigame, you don't have to, but Templar will have more damage output in AoE and cleave situations. Now, this is the Mythic Plus build for Lightsmith, and let's talk about a few things here. For the general tree, this is going to apply to Lightsmith and Templar in terms of Mythic Plus stuff. Basically, I've kind of taken a lot of default talents that can be adjusted. So for example, if you don't need your Dispel in a certain dungeon, you can swap your Dispel over to Imperial Ward. This gives your Lay on Hands an armor increase, nice bonus. You can also move Fists of Justice over here, but I think Fists of Justice generally is more useful, but either could work. If you really need your Cleanse Toxins, you can swap it over if you want that. I just default have these other talents over here. Moving down the tree, you basically have a bunch of options of what you can take depending on what you need in a dungeon. If you need Bop, you can obviously have Bop. You can shift things around, like Freedom doesn't necessarily need to be here either. You can grab Imperial Ward with that if you don't need Freedom. If you really need Unbound Freedom, you can move things like Bop. You can move things like 1 minute sack. You can even remove some damage done from Eye for an Eye. If you really need utility, like if you really need Unbound Freedom and Blessing of Protection, you can drop this and grab that. If you really need CDR and Blessing of Protection and Freedom, you can do this. It is a bit of a damage loss, but it's not the end of the world there, and it's something you're happy to sacrifice. There's also the choice on how to path down this left side. The main thing here, lead the charge is what your default kind of option is. It's kind of weak. It's just some move speed. The CDR is basically a nothing burger. But if you're ever in a situation where there are poison or disease dispels, I would say you'd take Righteous Protection. This isn't going to be every dungeon. In fact, it's probably going to be less than half the dungeons if I can remember properly off the top of my head. But in the dungeons where there are poison and disease dispels, this is going to be good. It essentially makes sack an immunity to those things, and it just makes it better than lead the charge. But in all those other situations, you can just run lead the charge for a bit of extra move speed. That's the general tree. A lot of flexibility there in a lot of cases. Moving on to the actual Lightsmith talents. Pretty straightforward. You're taking Sanctification. Make sure you always rebuff yourself here when you're going to new dungeons and stuff. It can get a little finicky if you like change talents. We still go Tempered in Battle because this is just very low value. So this is still going to give some defensive value. Still going Divine Inspiration for the procs. And in keys, you do Divine Guidance. And this is going to affect your rotation later. Basically, your Holy Power spenders are going to empower your Consecrates, and you're going to want to use those Consecrates when they're fully empowered. The stack's up to 5. Going into the Protection build here, I've assumed you need Spell Warding. Obviously, if you do not need Spell Warding, you can feel free to drop this point, and most likely you'd probably put it in as Inspiring Vanguard just to get that extra strength percentage there and the increased proc chance. Also, if you look at the Capstone area, you can see you have a bit more flexibility now. So Uther's Council was previously kind of a staple because it was 30% CDR is huge. Now with the nerf, it's much less important. So you see I have both Moment of Glory here and Eye of Tear. So this gives you a bunch more defensive coverage. You don't need to take both of these though. If you really prefer to have Uther's Council for something, you can grab that. You can also grab Bastion of Light with this point. If you really just don't like Moment of Glory for whatever reason, you can grab Inmost Light, though I think generally I'd rather have Moment of Glory in a lot of cases over Eye of Tear. Just really if you need another defensive to rotate through is where Eye of Tear gets value in the Lightsmith tree specifically. But these points are flexible. Like I said, you can kind of throw them where you need them depending on the dungeon. And that's kind of Lightsmith in Mythic Plus. In the raid thing, first thing to note, I mean, there's just a different pathing. Generally, you don't need a Dispel. I think there is like one fight potentially where you need to Dispel this raid, so you'd want to grab that there. This is bugged, but it's just kind of like you have to spend these talents somewhere. So, you know, you don't have to take this, but not bad. Again, you also not often stunning in a raid, but sometimes you might. So this could be valuable sometimes. It's just a general talent build. You go down the left side here, and this is where all the optional talents are. So you can see, hey, I don't care about Aura Radius. I really need Bop. Boom. I really need Bop CDR, actually. Boom. You got that. I really need Unbound Freedom. This also, if you need 1 minute sack, you can do this. This kind of turns sack into a damage CD almost, where you can sack your co-tank when they're taking heavy damage. And yeah, you're obviously going to be taking that the Blessing of Sacrifice damage yourself, but it's also going to give you a damage hit as well. So this is just there because it does damage. But if you don't need that, boom, you need Bop, you need Unbound Freedom, you need any of this stuff, feel free to move it around as you need it. As you need it. All those points I just clicked on, very flexible. Same deal here with Lead the Charge. I'm pretty sure you're just going to play Lead the Charge because you don't need Righteous Protection really on anything in the raid. And then it's just pretty straightforward the rest of the way there. Notable change in the Lightsmith tree, we've dropped Divine Guidance and we've taken Blessed Assurance. This is very important. It does impact your rotation because we've now also opted to take Hammer of the Righteous in raid over Blessed Hammer, and this is where you get the big juicy single target damage. You kind of weave in these Hammer of the Righteouses as you empower them by spending Holy Power. So you hit a Shield of the Righteous, that empowers your next Hammer of the Righteous to deal the most single target damage out of any button press you have. So it's very powerful. You don't want to waste any procs of this if you can. And then just like the Mythic Plus build, I did assume that you need Blessing of Spell Warding, but this is a talent that you can easily swap out depending on what you actually need. If you don't need Spell Warding, if there's some extra targets, you get Soaring Shield. If you want just a little bit extra throughput, you get Light of the Titans. But there's not a lot of other great stuff here because you kind of have a lot more talent points in this area in the raid build because we are opting not to go for the spell block stuff, which I guess I should have talked about. Basically, this is part of the spell block package where it gets you up to 48% increased spell block. This with 2 points gives you 30% when you were to glory. This gives you 10% here when you Avenger's Shield, so that's 40, and then you get flat 8% here, 48% spell block. You can use that to get 100% block up time on your spells. You don't care about that in raid. It's more of a Mythic Plus thing, and so you drop all these points, and you can get things like Sanctuary, giving you much better Consecrate uptime and some like extra Consecrate damage and duration here as well. But this is very, very important in the Mythic Plus build, and that's why it was included. But yeah, not needed for raid. Don't worry about that. Even in lower keys, like you're just doing weekly keys, you can drop that package as well and just play this for some better damage and Consecrate uptime as well. We've also opted for Moment of Glory here in the Lightsmith build in the Capstone area. If you really need to take stuff like Bubble Taunt, to take stuff like Eye of Tear, you can opt to like drop this stuff here and do something like this if you prefer it. But you know, this is kind of the default. You can also opt, if you really want to, is you can drop Resolute Defender if you don't need the CDR, and you can grab Bastion of Light to path down here, and then you can do like, hey, I need Eye Tier, or hey, I also need Bubble Taunt, and then you can drop Moment of Glory to do that. So that is something you can do just depending on what you actually need on a given boss fight for Lightsmith. From there, let's move on to Templar. So we're in raid. Let's talk about Templar raid. So for this build, again, the general tree is the exact same. So the Templar raid build and the Lightsmith raid build, exact same general tree. Won't go over that, so I'm going to focus here on the first Templar talents. These are the same for both, also raid and Mythic Plus. You know, Zealous Vindication, getting Sanctification on this one, get the move speed on that one. No changes here. Nothing to worry about with that. So in the actual tree itself, you're going to Blessed Hammer. It's got 3 charges. So instead of the 2 charges of Hammer of the Righteous, and also doesn't have the target requirement, so that's kind of why you prefer this. It helps a lot with the higher calling extensions here of your Shake the Heavens, which is a key part of Templar. But the whole thing is like, you're here, you really want to make sure that you're extending the Shake the Heavens buff for as much as possible, because it feeds into you getting more Hammer of the Light procs here, as well as just generally doing more damage because you're calling down more random damage hammers, the Empyrean hammers, and these hammers are also amped up by crit. So it's just basically this whole feedback loop of you maintain this buff as much as you can, and it makes you more powerful, and it helps you maintain the buff more. So it can be very punishing if you ever drop the buff or ever mess up your buff maintenance or whatever, but very, very powerful output if you are able to sustain it. Now, the one thing for Templar is that in raid, it's again losing a little bit, it seems, on pure single target compared to Lightsmith, but whenever there's cleave, it is definitely excelling. So you have the option here to adjust this build slightly depending on the amount of AoE or cleave. For example, if you Tears Enforcer, really good if there's stacked AoE, especially if the AoE is stacked on the boss. So you can do things like, hey, I don't really need spell warding. Let's throw that over here. Maybe I don't really need Seal of Reprisal either. Blessed Hammer damage is much lower than Hammer of the Righteous. You can throw that here. If there's a lot of targets, you can also say, hey, I don't really care about the defensiveness of Barricade of Faith. Throw that over to Soaring Shield, and all of a sudden you have a very good cleave build here where your Avenger's Shield is hitting more targets, and it's also splashing those targets, assuming again those targets are stacked. You don't have to do all of this. Maybe you only want the extra target hits and you need spell warding and get some block as well. You can also go down here into the Capstone area where you again have the ability to drop like Resolute Defender. Maybe you want Bubble Taunt. Maybe you want Uther's Counsel, depending on how the timings work. Maybe you just want to do a little bit more damage. You can put these points over into Farron Marcus's fervor for some more Avenger Shield primary target damage. Maybe there's so many targets like I was talking about, and you want to be able to get the extra parry from Strength and Adversity. Very rare situation, but sometimes could be a thing. And then you also want to do the parry stuff up here, not the parry, the splash damage stuff up here, but you still want spell warding, so you can put one of those points up here to be able to preserve spell warding as an example. So a lot of flexibility depending on the amount of cleave and the amount of AoE damage you want to be doing on a given fight. And so those are just some changes you can make to this build to suit a specific boss fight. Finally, we have the Templar Mythic Plus build, which again is looking quite good in AoE here. Again, not going to talk about the Paladin tree very much outside of punishment specifically. This becomes very important for Templar because it is something that allows you to cast Avenger's Shield when it otherwise would not extend with higher calling, because the Blessed Hammer here that you get from successfully kicking something with Avenger's Shield does trigger the higher calling extension. So in that situation, Avenger's Shield specifically is actually a good button press if you can guarantee you're going to get a kick for it, because otherwise it becomes a pretty decent DPS loss, which we'll talk about in the rotation section. Again, no changes to the actual Templar tree there. Going over to the protection tree, we've again assumed you need spell warding. If you do not need spell warding, you can opt for Inspiring Vanguard. Another thing, if you don't care about reaching your spell block cap, which you potentially will not care about depending on the dungeon, you can opt to take these 3 points out here, because these are what would, help you get that spell block. Like I said, Faith and Light, Word of Glory, get 30% block. And you can instead put this in Inspiring Vanguard, Sanctuary, and Consecration and Flame. Gives you some extra damage, gives you some guaranteed consecration uptime, makes it a lot easier to maintain your consecrate. So if you don't care about spell block, this is something you can do in any dungeons that are, you don't care about it, or in just, you're doing weekly keys, you want to slam, you don't want to worry about consecrate, pop this, you're totally fine. But, if you ever do care about spell block, this is what you want to run. Also, potentially you could swap out Tyrion's Devotion, because Templar has way less CDR on Lay on Hands compared to Lightsmith. So you could swap to Light of the Titans, especially if it's in a dungeon where you are taking a lot of periodic damage and you can get a lot of value out of the 100% increase of Light of the Titans on your Word of Glory hot. Potentially a value pick in those situations. But again, default, I'll put on Tyrion's Devotion. Otherwise, you're just generally much more locked in this capstone area, especially in Mythic Plus, where you really want Bubble Taunt. You need Inmost Light and Eye of Tyr in order to proc your base kit, your Hammer of Lights, at as low a CD as possible. You really want this parry in Mythic Plus, right? It's still very valuable even after the nerf, and you want your CDR stuff and your pseudo cheat death and all that stuff as well. So a lot less flexible when it comes to a Mythic Plus in terms of the capstone area of the build. All right, so we've talked about the talent builds. Now, how do you actually play the spec? Once again, I'm going to split this up into Lightsmith versus Templar, as they do have slightly different priorities. Note that the priorities I am going to show on screen for you guys do not consider cooldowns like Avenging Wrath, Eye of Tyr, or Divine Toll, which for the most part should be sent as close on cooldown as possible, unless they would be wasted, as you do want to maximize the total uptime and number of uses over the course of a dungeon or boss encounter. Starting with Lightsmith, a big part of your rotation is going to be whether you've chosen Divine Guidance, Empower and Consecrate, or Blessed Assurance to empower Hammer of the Righteous, as I talked about. If you're running Divine Guidance, pressing Consecrate with 5 stacks of that buff shoots straight up to the top of the list, along with maintaining Consecrate itself, whereas Blessed Assurance makes any boosted Hammer of the Righteous cast the highest damage generator you have, so you want to do your best not to waste any procs of this and use it before any other spenders unless you're going to be capped. Outside of that, the other thing to worry about as Lightsmith is maximizing your capstone blessing of the Forge. To do this, you want to try and cast Sacred Weapon in the back half of your Avenging Wrath, such that you extend the Sacred Weapon you get by default, which can only be done if it has 5 seconds or less remaining, as to not waste any of the duration of your new Sacred Weapon. This will give a decent damage boost overall, but something to be aware of here is that your random procs from Divine Inspiration can sometimes cover for you if you get a little bit lucky, so you want to make sure that if that ever happens, you still send that Sacred Weapon so you don't waste any cooldown reduction on future casts of this ability, but you do want to still wait for 5 seconds or less on your active weapon. Just don't worry about lining it up with wings. From there, it's pretty straightforward. Don't cap on Holy Power. Use Avenger's Shield in AoE or if Moment of Glory is active. Otherwise, just use your standard generators. Don't cap on Holy Armaments, Avenger's Shield, and Hammer of the Righteous in single target. And if you've got nothing else you can do, you can spend spare Holy Bulwarks, Word of Glories, or a fresh Consecrate early. Then we have Templar, where the biggest thing is that Avenger's Shield falls pretty far down the priority list while Shake the Heavens is active, because your other 3 generators all extend that buff while Avenger's Shield does not. The exception here, like I mentioned, is the Punishment talent, where if you interrupt with Avenger's Shield while that talent is taken, you cast an extra Blessed Hammer, and this Blessed Hammer does proc the Shake the Heavens extension. So in that specific case, it is totally fine to press Avenger's Shield. Now, I also have a note here next to Avenger's Shield talking about defensiveness, because there is actually an argument to be made if you really need to maintain defensive buffs like the parry from Strength in Adversity or the block and Barricade of Faith, it can be worth it. Just hit that Avenger's Shield and just eat that slight damage loss that it does cost. Otherwise, again, you'd rather hit Blessed Hammer if you're looking to optimize damage and your Shake the Heavens is active. But if you need that defense, this is an option. Otherwise, it falls pretty far down the list, as you can see. Hammer of the Light, of course, is your big damage hit, so it's going to shoot up right to the top of the priority, though keep in mind this has a 12-second duration, where you can cast it after it procs. So if you're really trying to min-max your Shake the Heavens uptime, it can sometimes be beneficial to delay this cast by like 6 to 8 seconds, but letting it expire is obviously way, way worse. So you want to make sure that never happens. You always send these procs. The only other weird difference here for Templar is that casting your free Word of Glory procs while Shake the Heavens is active is actually a DPS increase thanks to the Hammerfall hero talent, which causes it to call down Empyrean Hammers when you use it, and doubled when Shake the Heavens is active. So that specifically gets pushed up the list slightly, but overall there's just quite few similarities between the two hero trees in terms of rotation, outside the minor differences with Avenger's Shield versus the potential buffs you can do to specific abilities from Lightsmith. Next up, I want to talk a bit about Paladin survivability and cooldown usage, as you have quite a few short cooldowns to manage both offensively and defensively, as well as several different layers of defensive buffs that you can maintain depending on how heavy your damage intake is. For general damage intake, you are usually safe by just maintaining Consecrate and Shield of the Righteous, which you'll want to do as close to 100% uptime as possible to smooth out incoming damage. Consecration can sometimes be difficult to maintain in heavy movement situations, so if that's the case, you can grab Sanctuary talent if you're able to afford it, as this node basically solves all potential uptime issues that you may face. Outside of that initial line of defense, you also have quite a few defensive boosts tied to Avenger's Shield, which we discussed. You got the Bulwark of Order Absorb Shield. You've also got Barricade of Faith and Strength in Adversity, which offer block and parry respectively. Maintaining these buffs in particular is important in Mythic Plus content, meaning that you want to make sure that you are casting Avenger's Shield at least once every 10 seconds to maintain them. When it comes to healing, your main ability is Word of Glory, which can be cast either on yourself or an ally, though it does gain an additional boost based on missing health if used on yourself. As previously mentioned, Word of Glory does cost Holy Power. However, when you gain the Shining Light buff, it becomes free to cast. So generally, you'll only want to use this if the ability is available to be free. Otherwise, you want to spend your Holy Power on Shield of the Righteous instead to maintain that buff and deal damage. Like Avenger's Shield, this ability also has a defensive buff tied to it when spec'd into Faith in the Light, which is quite a large boost to your durability when active, particularly if you're looking to hit 100% spell block, as we discussed in the talent section, and we'll again discuss a little bit later in the stats section. Moving on to Paladin's signature cooldown, we have Avenging Wrath. This is a significant increase to both your offensive and defensive throughput, meaning regardless of the content you're doing, you should be trying to maximize the number of times you can cast this ability throughout a dungeon or raid. This usually leads to you wanting to press this ability as close to on cooldown as possible, with the only exceptions being if you explicitly need to wait to burst something down, like a damage amp phase or an important ad spawn, or if you're currently engaged with like a trash pack in a dungeon that's going to die before you get a full duration of the buff off. Using this ability on cooldown while also being able to hit things is very important, as the CDR provided by your Righteous Protector talent gets amplified by the Holy Power generation increase from having wings up, which also you can extend. So if you just have uptime in your wings, you're going to generate more Holy Power, you're going to spend more Holy Power, and you're going to get more wings CDR. So it's kind of this feedback loop. Finally, we have your standard defensive cooldowns, which you can rotate through to handle large tank busters or just moments of high damage intake. Ardent Defender is the shortest cooldown, and you consider the Resolute Defender talent CDR, plus it also prevents a single deadly attack if one occurs while it's active, so this is going to be the button that you're pressing the most. Guardian of Ancient Kings is your standard wall ability for when a large defensive is required, but you also get the ability to proc this from the Gift of the Golden Valkyr talent, which acts like a pseudo cheat death and is one of your stronger passive defensive tools. Eye of Tears is another defensive option, though it's also a significant offensive cooldown for Templar, meaning that if you choose that hero spec, you'll likely be using this on CD, similar to Avenging Wrath. There are also a few different immunities available for Prot, with Divine Shield, Blessing of Protection, and Blessing of Spell Warding. These are all long cooldowns with powerful abilities that can absorb an enormous amount of damage if used correctly, both on yourself and allies as well in the case of Bop and Spell Warding. Something to keep in mind is that both Bop and Divine Shield will cause you to lose aggro if used on yourself. However, you can prevent this when fighting a single mob by pairing it with the Hand of Reckoning taunt ability, forcing that mob to attack you despite you being immune. This is particularly strong on boss encounters both in Raid and Mythic Plus, where you are specifically fighting a single enemy with an individual heavy-hitting attack or applies a dangerous debuff. Though be aware, Bop only immunes you to physical-based damage and debuff, so other forms of damage you'll need to use either Divine Shield or Spell Warding. Speaking of Divine Shield, you can actually avoid using Hand of Reckoning entirely and use it against multiple enemies when spec'ing to the Final Stand talent, as that adds a 15-yard AoE taunt to the ability for the entire duration, allowing you to safely use it without worrying about aggro. And in fact, if you ever are losing aggro on multiple mobs, it can actually make this a very strong tool to get it all back. This freedom makes Divine Shield one of the most powerful defensives in the entire game when spec'ing to Final Stand, allowing you to survive things that would cause other tanks to just kind of flop over, whether that be massive amounts of direct damage or dangerous stacking periodic effects. Spell warding is much easier to use than the others as it doesn't have the same aggro downside, so it's a great defensive in boss fights that have heavy hitting magic hits and debuffs, as well as trash pulls that have a lot of tank targeted magic damage. From there, we can talk about stats, where like most other tank specs, you generally want to prioritize item level over everything else, as that gives you more strength, stamina, and armor, which tends to be more valuable than differences in secondary stats, with the exception of jewelry and trinkets, since they don't have all three. To begin, let's talk about what the stats do. Of course, the big one is strength, which increases the output of pretty much every single ability that you have. Plus, it also makes your Shield of the Righteous buff give more armor, and it also gives a bit of parry, so valuable both offensively and defensively. Haste is the staple stat for Prot, reducing your global cooldown so you can cast things more frequently, as well as the cooldown of several rotational abilities, including Judgment, Hammer of Wrath, Blessed Hammer, and Avenger's Shield, so you get to press more of your stronger buttons. This means more haste translates into more holy power generated, which means more damage and more defense, as that fuels both Shield of the Righteous uptime and cooldown reduction on your major defensives. Mastery is a very powerful defensive stat for Paladins, granting additional block chance and attack power passively, while also giving you a flat damage reduction when inside your Consecrate and allowing you to block periodic effects. Despite its defensive strength, it is a bit lacking in terms of offensive power. However, it's an important stat if you're looking to cap your spell block, which we discussed earlier. Basically, your talents give you a total of 48% block, and then you need to cover the remaining 52% with mastery, and this requires you to have roughly 10,800 mastery rating unbuffed, or 9,400 rating if you have the Shaman Sky Fury buff. This is not required by any means and is mostly something good specifically in very high Mythic Plus keys against bosses that have consistent magic hits or damage, so feel free to ignore this breakpoint in raid or if you're just doing weekly keys. Crit is a pretty straightforward stat, giving you a significant damage increase while also being converted into parry thanks to the Repose passive. It also has some good synergies with Lightsmith's Hammer and Anvil, as well as Templar's Wrathful Descent, making it one of the best raw damage stats available to Prot. Finally, we have Verse, which is just a flat % increase to your damage and healing, as well as half that value as a damage reduction. This sounds like it would be decent for most tanks, but Prot Paladin just gets better offensive value from Crit and Haste and better defensive value from Haste and Mastery, so you really just tend to avoid versatility. In terms of what you should be aiming for, as always, I recommend simming yourself to get the exact optimal gear set offensively. However, if you just want something quick and easy, just a priority system, I recommend item level and then followed by haste. And then if you care in high Mythic Plus, you can do mastery until 52% block. If you don't care, you can skip that. And then it goes crit, mastery, verse. Now, staying on the topic of gear just very briefly here, embellishments are looking like you're going to want 2 elemental focusing lens in raid, and then either 2 in Mythic Plus or 2 Dawn thread lining in Mythic Plus. These are both flexible embellishments, so you can craft them on any of your cape, bracers, belt, or boots, depending on what slots work best for you. If you want more details on embellishments, you want my thoughts on trinkets, you want a list of the best gear to hunt in Raid and Mythic Plus, consumables, enchants to use, even a bunch of useful macros specific to Prot Paladin, all of that is going to be included in the method guide linked below, which will be updated throughout the patch as things change. So to save some time, and because this video is getting already insanely long, I'm going to skip all that stuff, and you can go check out the written guide if you're interested. So there we have it. We're going to end here. Hopefully this video helps you playing and learning Prot Paladin. If it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more guide content like it, including Prot Paladin commentary videos for those looking to push 3K rating and keys, as well as cutting edge Mythic rating, which I also stream both on YouTube and over on Twitch. As always, I need to shout out all my amazing Patreons for their continued support, and I'll see everyone in the next video.